Isabella's hands trembled, her breath shallow as she watched the paramedics push past one another, desperate to save the Foxworth's baby. Lucy's tiny body was limp in the oxygen mask, and nothing was working. The baby's heart rate plummeted, the room heavy with tension. Then, Isabella saw it. A faint discoloration deep in Lucy's mouth, greenish-gray. She'd seen it before. "Stop," Isabella's voice sliced through the frantic air. "Check her throat, she's been poisoned." In an instant, the paramedics froze, their eyes darting toward Isabella, the lowly maid who was supposed to be invisible. But at that moment, she was anything but. The urgency in her voice wasn't from panic. It was the certainty of someone who knew exactly what was wrong. The baby's life was slipping away. But Isabella knew the truth that no one else did. No one expected the maid to have an answer. But Isabella had been here before when she was younger, when a child she knew died because no one recognized the signs in time. Now, Isabella was the one who had to make a choice: speak up and risk everything, or stay silent and watch Lucy die. The paramedics were still uncertain, but Isabella knew one thing for sure: if she didn't act, this baby wouldn't make it. Welcome back, everyone. And thank you, because this channel just hit 300 subscribers. That tells me you're here for stories that don't just entertain, but leave you thinking long after they end. Now, today's story begins in a room filled with panic. 7 trained paramedics, a crying millionaire, and a baby slipping away right in front of them. Every protocol was followed, every machine was running. And still, nothing worked. Then something unexpected happened. A quiet black maid, someone no one was paying attention to, stepped forward. No uniform, no title, just calm, instinct, and a decision that made everyone in the room freeze. What she did next shocked everyone and changed everything. Thank you again for 300 subscribers. Let's get into the story. As Isabella stood in the room, heart racing, her mind flashed back to another time, a time when she was a little girl, growing up in the tough streets of Houston. She had seen death up close before, but never like this. Back then, she was just a bystander, a kid too young to understand the real dangers lurking around her. But now, standing in the opulent Foxworth mansion, it all clicked. The life she once lived, the knowledge she had gained in the hardest ways, was now the key to saving a life. The shrill beeping of the monitors brought Isabella back to the present. She focused on the baby, Lucy, lying on the marble floor. Her tiny chest barely moved as the paramedics worked in a frenzy, yet the baby's color wasn't improving. Every breath Lucy took was a struggle, and time was slipping away. Isabella could see it. This wasn't just a regular medical emergency. Lucy was dying in front of them, and no one was doing a damn thing to stop it. The memories from her childhood flooded her mind. She remembered growing up in a neighborhood where survival was an everyday challenge. The streets were unforgiving, filled with drugs, violence, and the harsh realities of life. But there was one thing Isabella had learned early on: people didn't survive by ignoring the truth. They survived by recognizing danger before it took everything from them. She could still see the face of the child who had died when she was just 10 years old. A little girl, not much younger than Lucy, who had lived a few blocks away. The child had been fine one day, laughing and playing, only to collapse hours later, struggling to breathe. Her mother, frantic, had called for help, but no one knew what was happening. The doctors were baffled, the paramedics confused. It wasn't until too late that they discovered the truth. She had ingested a toxic substance that blocked her body's ability to absorb oxygen. It wasn't a choking hazard. It wasn't a typical accident. It was poison, slowly suffocating her from the inside out. Isabella had watched that little girl die, helpless, unable to understand why no one had recognized what was happening. She'd seen it too many times, people dying of things that couldn't be seen, things that weren't obvious until it was too late. She remembered standing in that hospital room, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on her chest as the little girl's mother screamed in despair. That was the moment Isabella learned to pay attention to the smallest details. The things that seemed insignificant were often the most dangerous. Now, standing in the Foxworth mansion, she was seeing those same signs. The greenish-gray discoloration inside Lucy's mouth, the labored breathing, the growing panic in the paramedics' faces. She wasn't just a maid here. She was the one who knew. She was the one who had the answer, the thing that no one else could see. Isabella's gaze flicked over to the Foxworth family, who were standing in the corner of the room, silent, unmoving. Chase Foxworth, the wealthy businessman who owned this mansion, was conspicuously absent, just as he always was when things went wrong. His wife, Maria, stood with her arms crossed, her face tight with concern, but there was no real fear in her eyes, just an unsettling calmness. The nanny, Sarah, was standing near the window, hands clenched at her sides, her eyes darting between the baby and the paramedics. Thomas, the driver, stood against the doorframe, his expression unreadable. Isabella noticed it immediately. They weren't reacting the way a family should. No one was screaming, no one was begging the paramedics to do more. There was no panic, no desperation. It was as if they were waiting for something that was already decided, something that they knew was coming. Isabella had learned early on that when people didn't react the way you expected them to, it meant they were hiding something. They knew something you didn't. And at that moment, she realized she wasn't just fighting to save Lucy's life. She was about to expose something much darker than a medical emergency. She looked back down at the baby, still struggling to breathe. The greenish-gray tint inside Lucy's mouth wasn't just a random anomaly. It was a sign, the same sign she had seen in that little girl all those years ago. Isabella knew what was happening. She knew what she had to do. But how had she ended up here, in this mansion, surrounded by the kind of wealth she could only dream of as a child? She'd never asked for this life. It wasn't a fairy tale. She hadn't come from privilege or wealth, and every day had been a struggle to get by. Her family had scraped by in a run-down apartment on the south side of Houston. There were days when food was scarce, and nights when her mother stayed up late, worrying about bills. Isabella had learned early that she couldn't rely on anyone to get her out of that life. She had to do it herself. It was after her mother passed away that Isabella knew she couldn't stay in the same place. She had to escape, had to find a way to get out of the cycle of poverty that had trapped so many before her. That's when she saw the job opening at the Foxworth mansion. The pay was more than she could have imagined. The benefits were even better, and for the first time in her life, she had the chance to work in a place where she could blend into the background, stay invisible. That was all she wanted. To be unseen, to be unnoticed, to live a life where she wasn't constantly fighting for every little thing. But now, as she stood in this mansion with Lucy's life slipping away, she realized that staying invisible was no longer an option. This wasn't a situation where she could blend into the walls and pretend like nothing was happening. She had the knowledge. She had the power to make a difference. Isabella turned back to the paramedics, her mind made up. She wasn't just going to save this baby. She was going to make sure that everyone in this room saw her, not as a maid, not as the help, but as someone who had the courage to do what needed to be done. "Stop," she shouted again, her voice sharp, cutting through the chaos. "I know what's happening. She's been poisoned. I saw it when I was a kid. I know what you're looking at." The paramedics paused, their eyes flicking toward her. For a moment, everything was still. They were trained professionals, used to handling life-and-death situations, but Isabella wasn't just another bystander. She was the one who had the answer. She met their gaze, her heart pumping. "Look at her throat. You need to treat it differently." The room went quiet. The Foxworth's eyes shifted from her to the baby. They were waiting, watching, but they weren't panicking. They weren't concerned. Isabella could feel the weight of their gaze, the tension thickening in the air. For the first time in her life, she realized that this was her moment. She wasn't just a maid. She was the one who could change everything. Isabella stepped forward, her feet heavy on the marble floor as if the weight of the room pressed down on her shoulders. The paramedics paused, their eyes flicking to her. They were professionals, trained to handle these kinds of crises, but she wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't even someone they should listen to. She was just the maid. But she couldn't stay silent. Not this time. "They're treating her the wrong way," Isabella said, her voice trembling but firm. This isn't a regular airway obstruction. She's been poisoned." The room fell silent. The paramedics exchanged uneasy glances, their movements slowing. One of them, a young man with a clipboard, stepped forward. "Ma'am, we appreciate your concern, but we're handling this." Isabella swallowed hard, the adrenaline in her blood pushing her to speak even louder. "I know what I'm talking about. I saw this happen before when I was a kid." Her voice caught, but she forced the words out. "A little girl died from this exact thing. The substance blocks the oxygen in the blood. It's not in her airway. She's suffocating from the inside." The paramedics looked at each other, skepticism written across their faces. Isabella's heart pounded in her chest. She had nothing left to lose. She looked at the baby, still struggling to breathe, her tiny chest barely rising. "I'm telling you, check her throat. It's the same thing. She's been poisoned." A tense beat passed before the lead paramedic. An older man with a furrowed brow took a step closer to Isabella. "You're sure?" "Yes," Isabella replied, her voice unwavering despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "I've seen it before. A mark inside the throat, greenish-gray. It's poisoning, and it's shutting her down. You have to act quickly." Another paramedic, a woman with short hair, stepped back from the baby, her eyes scanning Isabella. She hesitated but then nodded toward her partner. "Let's check it." The lead paramedic knelt down beside Lucy, carefully tilting her head back. He shined a flashlight into her throat, his face going from tense to stunned. "It's there," he muttered, his hand shaking slightly. What is this?" Without wasting another second, the paramedics moved into action. They quickly induced vomiting, administering the activated charcoal Isabella had suggested. Time seemed to freeze as the baby's body convulsed slightly, a weak cough escaping her tiny lips. Isabella's heart raced as the baby's color slowly began to return. Lucy's chest rose and fell more evenly now, her lips shifting from blue to a pale pink. Hope. For the first time in hours, there was hope. But even as the paramedics worked to stabilize Lucy, Isabella couldn't shake the nagging question. Why hadn't the Foxworths reacted the way any concerned parents would? Where was Chase, the father? Where was the mother's frantic need to hold her child? Maria, the house manager, stood motionless by the doorway, her face a mask of calm. Sarah, the nanny, hadn't even moved to check on the baby. And Thomas, the driver, hadn't shown a hint of worry. They didn't seem like parents fighting for their child's life. They seemed like spectators. Isabella's stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. As the paramedics worked quickly to stabilize Lucy, Isabella stood back, trying to steady her breath. The room, once filled with frantic energy, now felt strangely muted. Lucy's color was returning, and the baby's chest rose and fell with more regularity. The oxygen mask still covered her tiny face, but Isabella could tell she was starting to breathe on her own again. For the first time since this nightmare began, Isabella allowed herself a small breath of relief, but that sense of relief didn't last long. Her eyes drifted over to the Foxworth family, still standing in the corner of the room, untouched by the chaos unfolding before them. Maria, the house manager, stood with her arms crossed, a small frown on her face, but there was no panic, no motherly instinct to rush to the child's side. She wasn't speaking to anyone, just watching, her gaze fixed on Lucy with an unnerving calmness. It was as if she was observing a situation she had seen 1,000 times before, a cold detachment that sent a shiver down Isabella's spine. Sarah, the nanny, was standing by the window, her hands folded at her sides. She was staring out, her eyes distant, almost as though she had no emotional attachment to the situation at all. Isabella had seen nannies before mothers' helpers, who were often more concerned than the parents themselves, but Sarah was barely even flinching. Her posture was stiff, her expression blank. She didn't even look like she cared. And then there was Thomas, the family's driver. He was leaning against the doorway, arms crossed tightly over his chest, his face unreadable, but Isabella could see it in his eyes, the way he kept his distance, the way he watched the baby being worked on with that cold, calculating gaze. It wasn't the look of someone worried about a life hanging in the balance, it was the look of someone waiting for an outcome. Someone detached from the crisis as though they already knew what was going to happen. Something wasn't right. Isabella's gut tightened. She had worked with enough families to know how they reacted in times of real crisis. A mother would be in tears, screaming for the paramedics to hurry. A father would be pacing, too nervous to sit still. The staff might be frantic, trying to help in any way they could. But not the Foxworths. Not tonight. She glanced back at the baby, still hooked up to monitors, breathing more steadily now, but her gut told her this wasn't an accident. This wasn't some random health scare. There was something deeper going on, something far darker than anyone had admitted. The more Isabella thought about it, the more pieces began to fall into place. Chase Foxworth, the millionaire businessman who owned this mansion, was nowhere to be seen. No calls, no appearances, nothing. She had worked here long enough to know he was always in and out of town for business, but he had always been present during emergencies, at least present in some form. But tonight, when his daughter's life was on the line, nothing. He was absent, as usual, leaving the entire situation in the hands of the staff. Isabella's mind raced. Why wasn't he here? Where was he when his daughter was fighting for her life? She could feel the walls of suspicion closing in around her, but she didn't have enough pieces to make sense of it yet. She watched Maria step forward, her heels clicking against the marble as she approached the paramedics. She was speaking in hushed tones to one of them, her words too quiet for Isabella to hear. But Maria's posture, the way she seemed so in control of the situation, made Isabella's stomach twist. It was as if Maria was the one calling the shots, like she was the one who had everything figured out. But then why had Lucy been poisoned? Why had the child's life been hanging by a thread if Maria was so calm, so composed? Isabella's suspicion grew with every passing second. This wasn't an accident. The more she observed, the more it felt like everything was preordained. Lucy's life had been in danger, and the Foxworths had been watching it unfold like they already knew how it would end. But why? Isabella's heart raced again, but this time it wasn't out of fear for Lucy. This time, it was out of something much darker. The truth was hidden behind those calm faces, and Isabella wasn't going to let it stay hidden for long. The sound of the ambulance pulling away echoed in Isabella's ears as she stood in the empty hallway, still trying to catch her breath. The paramedics had managed to stabilize Lucy and rush her to the hospital, but Isabella remained in the Foxworth mansion, the weight of everything pressing down on her. For a moment, the house felt too quiet, too still. The chaos of the emergency had faded, but a strange tension lingered in the air. Isabella could still hear the low hum of the air conditioning, but it felt as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. For the first time, she felt like the walls were closing in on her. She leaned against the wall, her mind replaying the events of the past few hours. The frantic energy of the paramedics, the way Lucy's tiny body fought for every breath, the overwhelming sense of dread that had gripped her when she realized that no one else seemed to care about the baby's life except for her. She had done it. She had saved Lucy. She had stepped forward, against every expectation, against the fear of being dismissed, of being nothing more than the invisible maid. But now, standing here alone in the quiet of the mansion, Isabella wasn't sure if she felt relief, fear, or something else entirely. Isabella had always been invisible. That's what she'd learned growing up in the projects of Houston. If you wanted to survive, you had to blend in. You had to stay out of the way, to avoid being noticed. When you came from a place where every day was a fight, you learned to keep your head down and your mouth shut. No one cared about you. No one cared about the girl from the rundown apartment building with worn-out shoes and no future. You did what you had to do to survive, and then you disappeared again. But now, here she was, in a mansion surrounded by wealth, surrounded by people who lived lives she couldn't even imagine. She was still just a maid, still invisible in their eyes, but tonight she had done something they couldn't. She had saved their child. It felt strange, the power she had felt in that moment, the power of knowing something no one else did, the power of standing up when no one expected it. It was a feeling she wasn't used to. It wasn't about being seen or being praised. It was about knowing that, for once, she had mattered. She had made a difference. But then, a wave of guilt washed over her. Was it worth it? Did she just make a dangerous move by exposing the truth? She hadn't just saved Lucy, she had also exposed the cracks in the Foxworth family's perfect facade. What if they came after her now? What if they decided she knew too much? The Foxworths weren't like the families she had worked for in the past. They had power. Real power. And now Isabella was caught in something far bigger than she had ever imagined. She could feel the eyes of the staff, the quiet suspicion of Maria, Sarah, and Thomas. They knew something. They had always known something. And now, so did she. She couldn't ignore the way they had acted during the emergency, the way they had stood there, detached, as if they were waiting for something to happen. She couldn't ignore the silence in the room, the sense that Lucy's condition had been part of some larger, darker plan. Isabella's heart pounded again as the questions swirled in her mind. What had she really walked into? What had she uncovered, and what would she do now? For the first time in her life, she knew she couldn't go back to being invisible. The truth was out there now, and she was part of it. She had stepped into the light, whether she was ready for it or not. Sometimes, it's the people we ignore who have the power to change everything. Isabella was just a maid, but she did what no one else would. If you understand the weight of her decision, if you know what it's like to be invisible, you're going to want to follow her story. The morning light streamed through the grand windows of the Foxworth mansion, but the brightness did little to lift the heaviness Isabella felt in her chest. She moved through her daily chores in a haze, the soft rhythm of cleaning and dusting barely registering as she kept her eyes trained on the family. Something wasn't right. And no matter how she tried to ignore it, the feeling gnawed at her. The day after Lucy's emergency, the house was strangely quiet. The air was thick with unspoken words, with secrets that everyone seemed to know but never spoke aloud. The baby was still in the hospital, and while the family had expressed a vague sense of relief, there was no frantic rush to the hospital, no emotional collapse from Maria, no desperate father pacing the halls. It was as if the crisis had never happened at all. Isabella glanced over at Sarah, the nanny, who was standing in the hallway, talking to Maria in hushed tones. The conversation stopped abruptly when Sarah saw Isabella approaching, but not before Isabella caught a glimpse of Sarah's uneasy expression. Sarah avoided eye contact, her gaze shifting to the floor as she brushed past her, almost as though she were trying to distance herself from Isabella, from everything. Isabella's stomach twisted. Since Lucy's incident, Sarah had been distant, almost aloof. When Isabella had first arrived at the mansion, Sarah had been kind enough, always polite, always ready to engage, but now she seemed to be avoiding Lucy altogether, rarely visiting the baby's room, rarely showing any interest in the child she was supposed to care for. It wasn't normal. It wasn't right. Maria, the house manager, also had a strange, unsettling calm about her. After the emergency, Maria had moved through the halls like nothing had happened, giving out instructions as if it was just another day. Her voice was steady, without the tremor of concern that any mother would have shown after almost losing a child. Isabella had seen Maria handle the household with precision, but that level of control after something so intense felt wrong, too controlled. And Thomas, the driver. He hadn't said much after the emergency. He had simply stood in the corner of the room, watching as the paramedics worked. His eyes, cold and distant, never showed a flicker of real concern. As Isabella caught his gaze across the hallway, she felt a chill run down her spine. His stare wasn't just indifferent, it was calculated. It was the look of someone who knew more than they were letting on, someone who was waiting for something to happen, not for the crisis to resolve. He wasn't a bystander. He was part of something. But what? Isabella's heart began to race. She was piecing together something that didn't make sense. The Foxworths, Sarah, Maria, and Thomas, none of them seemed like the people they appeared to be. And that day, as she dusted the parlor and listened to hushed voices coming from the kitchen, Isabella overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. She was just out of earshot, but she caught enough words to know that something was wrong. Sarah's voice was low, strained. "We can't let this go on much longer, Maria. If someone finds out—" Maria's voice, cool and controlled, interrupted her. "No one will. The plan is already in motion. Everything is under control. Just stick to the plan." The word sent a shock through Isabella. The plan? What plan? She couldn't make out the rest of their conversation, but it was enough. They were hiding something. Something deliberate. Something they wanted to keep quiet. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't an accident, that Lucy's health scare wasn't just a random emergency. It was part of something much bigger. As Isabella moved away from the doorway, her mind raced. She had never been this close to a mystery before. She had always been on the outside, observing, blending in. But now, she was at the heart of something dangerous, something she didn't fully understand. The pieces weren't fitting together, and every time she thought she knew what was going on, something shifted, something darker. She had to know more. She couldn't just ignore this, couldn't let the Foxworths or anyone continue this game while a child's life was at stake. Isabella's resolve hardened. The mansion, once a place where she stayed invisible, now felt like a maze, and she was stuck inside it, trying to find the truth. But she had to be careful. She couldn't trust anyone, not even the people who were supposed to be her co-workers, her family. Every step she took, every glance she made towards Sarah, Maria, or Thomas, felt like she was sinking deeper into a web of deception, and Isabella was trapped, whether she liked it or not. Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The more she observed the Foxworth family and their staff, the more she felt like she was being pulled into a tangled web of secrets no one wanted to acknowledge. The air in the mansion was thick with unspoken words, and Isabella knew she couldn't keep pretending she didn't see what was happening. She had to know the truth, and the only person who could give her answers was Sarah, the nanny. Sarah had been acting strange for days, avoiding Lucy and never showing the kind of concern a nanny should. Isabella had watched her closely, noting every hesitation, every subtle glance Sarah shot toward Maria or Thomas when they spoke. It was time to confront her. Isabella found Sarah in the kitchen, staring out the window, lost in thought. The silence between them stretched for a moment before Isabella broke it, her voice steady but firm. "Sarah, I need to talk to you," Isabella said, walking into the room and closing the door behind her. Sarah tensed, turning slowly. There was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a flash of something that could only be described as fear. "Isabella, what's going on?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice calm but failing to hide the unease creeping in. "I'm done pretending like everything's normal here," Isabella said, her voice rising slightly with frustration. "What happened to Lucy wasn't an accident. I saw the signs. And you and everyone else, Maria, Thomas, you're all hiding something." Sarah's face hardened, and she took a step back, her eyes darting toward the door as if considering making a run for it. But Isabella wasn't going to let her off that easy. "Don't deny it," Isabella pressed, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "I know you've been avoiding the baby. I saw the way you acted during the emergency. And I saw the way you and Maria were talking. What's going on, Sarah? What are you not telling me?" Sarah's face went pale, her hands trembling slightly. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out at first. Finally, she exhaled sharply, as though making a decision. I can't tell you everything, Isabella," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. Isabella's heart pounded in her chest. This was it, the moment she could finally get the answers she needed. "Why not?" Isabella demanded, stepping closer. "Is this about Lucy? Is this about the Foxworths? What's the real story here?" Sarah's eyes flickered toward the door again, but she didn't move. She swallowed hard, her expression filled with guilt and fear. "Chase Foxworth isn't the man you think he is. His wealth, it's built on corruption. Dirty business deals, illegal ventures. There are whispers. Things I can't even begin to explain." She paused, her voice faltering. "Lucy. She's part of a bigger plan. A plan to gain even more wealth even if it means using her. Isabella felt the blood drain from her face. What do you mean? How can they use their own child like that? Sarah's voice trembled. I don't know all the details, but the family, Maria, Thomas, they're in on it. They've been helping Chase with his plans. And Lucy, well, she's the key to it all. There's more at play here than just a family wanting a child. Much more. Isabella's mind spun. She had known something was off, but this was beyond anything she could have imagined. The Foxworths weren't just a wealthy family, they were a family built on lies, deception, and a web of corruption. And Lucy? She wasn't just a child. She was leverage. I don't know what's going to happen next, Sarah said, her voice low, almost defeated. But I know nothing's going to be the same again. You're in this now, Isabella. You've seen too much. Isabella stepped back, her head swimming with the magnitude of what Sarah had just said. She felt a coldness settle in her chest, a dread that tightened around her throat. This was just the beginning. The truth was far more complicated and far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Isabella stared at Sarah, her mind racing. You better start telling me everything you know, she said, her voice steady but sharp, because if I'm going to get out of this alive, I need to know exactly what I'm dealing with. Sarah's face twisted with a look of desperation. She opened her mouth to speak again, but before she could, the door creaked open, and Maria's voice cut through the tension. Isabella, Maria said, her tone too calm. You're needed in the main hall, now. Isabella turned, her blood running cold. She knew this was just the beginning, and it was only a matter of time before the Foxworths realized just how much she knew. Sometimes, it's the people we ignore who have the power to change everything. Isabella was just a maid, but she did what no one else would. If you understand the weight of her decision, if you know what it's like to be invisible, you're going to want to follow her story. Isabella stood in front of the large ornate mirror in the Foxworth mansion's hallway, her reflection staring back at her with a mixture of disbelief and resolve. The events of the past few days had shaken her to her core, but now standing in the silence of the empty house, she realized the true stakes. This was no longer just about a child's health crisis. It was about something much darker, something that had been lurking beneath the surface of this family's perfect facade. She had seen it in the eyes of the staff, heard it in the hushed tones of Sarah, Maria, and Thomas. The way they had all acted too calm, too detached. They knew what had happened to Lucy. They knew what had been done. But worse than that, they had been part of it. Part of a plan that involved using a baby as leverage in a game of power and wealth. And the more Isabella thought about it, the more she understood. Lucy wasn't just a victim of neglect. She was a victim of something much more calculated, much more sinister. Isabella's breath caught in her chest. She had no idea how deep this went. She had never imagined she would be standing here, trying to piece together a web of corruption that reached far beyond this mansion. But now that she knew, now that she understood the stakes, there was no turning back. She couldn't ignore it. But she also couldn't ignore the danger. The weight of the decision hung heavy on her shoulders. Stay silent. Pretend nothing happened. She could blend back into the background, do her work, keep her head down. The Foxworths would continue on with their lives, and she could keep hers. Maybe, just maybe, she would be left alone. Or expose the truth. Step forward, risk everything, and face whatever came her way. The secrets she had uncovered could tear the Foxworths apart. They could destroy everything they had worked so hard to build. But exposing them would put her in danger she couldn't even begin to comprehend. They had the power to ruin her, to make sure she never saw the light of day again. As she walked through the mansion, the once beautiful rooms now felt suffocating, the silence pressing in on her. She could feel the eyes of the staff on her, could feel the threat hanging in the air. They were watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake, to slip up. She had no illusions anymore. They knew she had seen too much, and they wouldn't let her go without a fight. She had already heard the whispers. A warning in the form of a message slipped under her door late last night. The words scrawled in hurried handwriting. Stay quiet, or you'll regret it. Another message followed hours later, left on her cleaning cart. You don't know who you're dealing with. And the last one left in a folded note on her bed was the most chilling of all. This is your only warning. If you talk, it won't just be you who suffers. Her heart pounded in her chest as she felt the walls closing in. The message was clear: shut up, or face the consequences. She could feel their eyes on her, their anger building, just waiting for her to step out of line. But Isabella refused to back down. She was no longer the invisible maid who stayed quiet. She had seen too much, and she couldn't ignore it. Not for Lucy, not for herself. The fear was there, sharp and real, but so was the resolve. The Foxworths had used a child for their own gain, and Isabella wasn't going to let them get away with it. She had a choice to make: stay silent and protect herself, or expose the truth and risk it all. Her mind was made up. She couldn't live in a world where she did nothing, where she let this family get away with their dark deeds. Not when she had the power to make a difference. Isabella walked to the front door of the mansion, her heart heavy but determined. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing: she couldn't walk away. Sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones that save lives, but no one ever tells you what happens next. If you've ever had to make a decision that changed everything, now's the time to stand with Isabella and subscribe. The mansion felt different now. Like a cage Isabella couldn't escape, no matter how many halls she walked through. The weight of the truth sat heavily on her chest as she walked into the grand living room, her heart pounding in her ears. Today would change everything. Today, she was going to expose the Foxworths for what they truly were. She had spent days, even weeks, gathering the pieces. The hushed conversations she overheard, the messages left for her, the way the Foxworths and their staff had all but confirmed her suspicions. Everything led her to one conclusion. This wasn't a family torn apart by an accident or neglect. This was something calculated, something sinister. They had poisoned Lucy for a reason, one that had nothing to do with care or love. Isabella's eyes locked on the door to the office, the one where Chase Foxworth spent most of his time, plotting his business empire, making deals, hiding his darkest secrets. She could feel the familiar pulse of fear in her chest, but it didn't stop her. No, today she wasn't the invisible maid. Today she was the one with the power. She entered the room, her footsteps barely making a sound on the polished floors. Chase Foxworth was sitting behind his desk, his eyes never leaving the screen of his laptop. Maria was by the window, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. Sarah was standing near the doorway, her body tense. Thomas was at the far end of the room, looking out of place, as always. They all turned toward her as she walked in. The silence was suffocating, thick with tension. Isabella's heart was racing, but she held her ground, her voice steady, unwavering. "I know what you've been doing," she said, her words slicing through the thick silence like a knife. "I know about Lucy. I know about the poisoning, and I know about your plan to use her for your own gain." For a moment, no one spoke. Chase Foxworth's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he stood up from his desk. His cold, calculating gaze was a stark contrast to the warmth he had tried to project as a father. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Chase said, his voice low, laced with venom, but even he couldn't hide the flicker of fear that crossed his face. "Oh, I think I do," Isabella replied, her voice gaining strength. "I've seen the signs. I've heard the conversations. You've been poisoning Lucy for months. You've been using her as leverage to gain more wealth. Your empire, your deals, all of it. You were willing to sacrifice your own daughter to secure more money." The room went still. Isabella could feel the eyes of the staff on her, their discomfort palpable. Sarah's face was pale, and she looked as though she might collapse at any moment. Maria's expression remained unchanged, but Isabella could see the subtle tension in her shoulders. Thomas, however, stood stock still, his cold eyes locked on Isabella. Chase stepped toward her, his movements slow but deliberate. "You think you know everything? You think you've got it all figured out?" His voice was dangerously calm, but there was a rawness to it now that hadn't been there before. You have no idea what's at stake here. What we've worked for. I know exactly what's at stake, Isabella said, standing taller. You've worked to make yourselves rich, to build an empire on the backs of people like Lucy, and you thought no one would notice, that no one would care. But I care, and Lucy deserves better. The words hung in the air, the weight of them settling over everyone in the room. Chase clenched his fists, his face contorting with rage. You're making a huge mistake, Isabella, he spat, his eyes burning with fury. You have no idea what you're dealing with. You think you can just waltz in here and expose everything? You have no power here. Isabella's breath quickened, but she refused to back down. She was done being invisible, done letting these people walk all over her. I may not have the money, the power, or the connections you have, Chase, but I have something more powerful than that. The truth. She turned to face the staff, her eyes scanning each one of them. You're all complicit in this. You've seen what's happening. You've let it happen. And now you're all going to have to live with the consequences. The silence that followed was deafening, and for the first time Isabella saw the cracks in the perfect lives they had all tried to maintain. The truth was out, and there was no going back. If you're still here, it's because you believe in standing up for what's right even when it's dangerous. Now subscribe. Isabella took a stand when no one else would. What will you do when your moment comes? Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine, so do check it out. And do well to click on the subscribe button and turn on notifications for the next story.